Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for attending today, and we hope you enjoy the session. So, why are we here today? Well, basically, Consumer Duty is not new news, but recent fines and Dear CEO letters from the Financial Conduct Authority show that it's still very much a hot topic at the moment. And there's clearly more to be done in the financial services sector to support vulnerable customers. But by the end of today, you'll have our toolkit on what you can do to help to identify and serve customers appropriately. So today, the approach that we're going to take is we're going to cover off a quick recap on consumer duty and vulnerability, and then focus on how to apply data and segmentation as a macro lens to better understand customers. Following that, we'll then explore identifying more individualized vulnerability indicators and how you can use those. And then how to apply the insight to customer journeys and experiences through delivering change and good outcomes for customers. So, consumer duty. As I've said, it's not exactly new. Many of you will be very familiar with it to differing degrees because of the natures of your job. So we're not going to go into it in detail. However, just to remind ourselves, the Consumer Duty's mandate is to ensure that financial services firms deliver good outcomes for all customers across all products and services that are offered. And that customer needs and prevention of harm occurs at every stage in the different journeys that the customers undertake with those products and services. And this applies whether or not it's journeys that are online, over the phone, or in person. So ultimately, and that can only help to drive growth. Ensuring compliance across all areas of the business to deliver good outcomes. In order to do that, you need to ensure that your staff and the teams across the organization are able to come together and that they're well equipped to handle customer needs and wants. This means that you've got to have a really deep understanding of your customers and the journeys that they take across your products and services. And you need to assess where there's potential for customer harm. This is especially the case for customers with characteristics of vulnerability, so that they don't have worse outcomes as a result of their vulnerability. So what do we mean by vulnerable customers? The FCA's definition of vulnerability here is deliberately broad. Essentially, as we'll explore today, vulnerability is a spectrum of risk. It's far broader, more fluid and dynamic than it appears at first glance, and this does have big implications for compliance. The FCA has already identified where firms are failing, like these examples here. And they're currently looking at conducting a review into how firms are acting in order to understand and respond to the needs of customers in vulnerable circumstances. Now, they were due to share their findings by the end of this year, but that now is planned for Q1 of 2025. So we look forward to seeing that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move into talking about a practical toolkit and tips to improve the understanding of vulnerability, customer needs, and applying those insights to customer journeys and experiences. And at this point, I'll hand over to Jamie to start the process.
So, whilst vulnerability is a very personal thing, it can be beneficial to begin by taking a step back. A broader view can give a really useful snapshot of where the vulnerabilities might lie, which customers are most affected, and how. And by identifying these customers, the products and services they're most likely to use, then you start to get an idea of where to focus first, or which areas may require more consideration to best reach those good outcomes we all seek. And so to help us walk through some examples and demonstrate some real data, I'm going to use CACI's own segmentation, Fresco. Now, other segmentation products are available, and I'm pretty sure that nearly all of you here will have something similar, if not Fresco itself, within your organization. What's coming over the next few slides is just as applicable to any segments you've got coded on your customers. Right, then, Fresco in a nutshell, we break the adult population of the UK down into 12 segments at the top level. There are smaller subsegments underneath this, which are useful for deeper analysis or predictive modelling, but we're just going to stick to the 12 here. An important point to note is that Fresco classifies at an individual person level. And that's really crucial because otherwise you won't capture the variances and vulnerabilities and you'll risk underestimating them. And besides including a lot of great financial, behavioural, attitudinal data points, there's also quite a strong life stage element too. On the next slide, you can see the names of the 12 Fresco segments. That life stage element becomes a bit more apparent when you look at young dependents and starting out in segments 1 and 2, right through to budgeting elderly in segment 12. You can see the segments listed out on the left-hand side on the next slide. And I really want to show here how a good segmentation can start highlighting some patterns across something like vulnerability. These 3 data points are all taken from the Financial Research Survey. And if you've got a market segmentation yourselves that's widely available on research and panels, then you can start looking at things like this. Now here, the coloured bars are all indexes, and they each compare each segment to a UK average. The more the bar moves to the right, the more prevalent that characteristic is. And the opposite is true for bars to the left. And if a bar is small and close to 100 in the middle, it means it's in line with the average. So for example, let's take that first number, 131. What that means, and it suggests that young dependents are 1.31 times, or 31%, more likely than average to have fallen victim to fraud in the last year. In fact, fraud and identity theft appears to be much more common, relatively speaking, amongst the younger segments in the top half of those segments. And whilst perhaps surprising at first, it does align with the much lower levels of financial confidence you tend to see in these groups, not to mention much higher online activity, where smaller value scams, for example, are much more common. Over in the middle column, and as you might expect, it tells us that caring responsibilities become much more likely amongst the middle-aged and the family segments, whilst on the right-hand side, you can see just how age-skewed digital reluctance is in banking. Those budgeting elderly down at the bottom are by far the most likely, 3 and a bit times more likely, to be uncomfortable banking online. And the aim of this slide here is really to demonstrate the point about vulnerability not being a single definition. Anybody, any segment can be affected, all with different likelihoods. And in fact, those likelihoods themselves are likely to change themselves depending on the vulnerability itself. I want to draw your attention to just one segment, the midlife pressed renters in orange. Those are the only segment that we're all over-indexed in all 3 of those data points. The next couple of slides, we're just going to throw a bit of a spotlight on them. Now, midlife pressed renters are typically older families, empty nesters, got below average income, and quite often they're living in social housing. That panel on the left-hand side there is summarised from our Fresco pen portrait, and it's telling us that this segment is the most likely to be finding life difficult or just managing to make ends meet. But to enrich understanding beyond general demographics, you often have to look to new research. You may have access to some of your own research or research that's out there in the market, but you might not be sure how that data actually relates to your own customers. And that's where segmentation can be really, really useful. Most market segmentations are designed in a way to be easily applied to panels or respondents if they're not actually coded there already. And in this case, what we've done, we've used Fresco on the Financial Live survey to directly report on those FCA vulnerability drivers. Much as we saw with the Fresco data on the last slide, midlife pressed renters are significantly more likely to be affected by all 4 areas of vulnerability. In capability, for example, it is digital skills that are often missing. And this tallies with our stat we saw on online banking. This segment is almost 3 times more likely to experience health vulnerabilities, addiction, mental health illness, both being widely reported. Resilience is low. Some life events such as bereavement are more likely. And you can see how this sort of information can start to be applied through segments onto your own customer cohorts. And this can be very, very powerful in beginning to look at journeys and possible pain points. Now, Mira is going to speak about understanding experiences through personas, but sometimes it can be difficult to know where to start. If you're able to identify groups of customers that are more likely to experience certain events or more likely to hold particular products, you can then start mapping those against the vulnerability traits most likely to be present. In this example, we're going to take our midlife pressed renter and imagine that they've recently suffered a bereavement, having lost their partner with who they've got a joint account. We know from the data that this is not an unlikely scenario for this segment. And we also know that this segment is much less likely to get in touch through digital channels, often down to concerns around security and fraud. Therefore, a form on a web page wouldn't work for most midlife press renters, and instead a face-to-face appointment might be much more appropriate. And here, its empathetic staff could provide the confidence and the reassurance that this segment seeks. But let's take this one step further. If we were to dig into the Fresco segment data more, we can see increased likelihood of health problems, possibly leading things to like long-term sick. We also learn that midlife press renters are less likely to own a car, often relying on buses. And so, how easy would it be for them to actually visit a branch? Is it fair to expect them to? Perhaps you should check with them, offer a telephone appointment instead if they prefer, and deal with all the paperwork by post. From a macro point of view, and before choosing where and how to focus on the detailed journeys, you can use segmentation just like this to begin considering potential pain points. This can be especially useful in planning and designing qualitative research, for example, which we'll touch on later. Now, segmentations can also be incredibly useful when it comes to product and proposition. I'm moving on to the next slide. We're going to look at an example of that in action. Now, the FCA are keen that products and services are well designed to meet specific needs of customers, and not that one size fits all distributed to everyone. So a great example of this in action is an industry initiative spearheaded by Fair for All Finance. Fair for All are a not-for-profit organisation who work with banks and other lenders, and we teamed up with them to segment the financially vulnerable population across the UK. And we did that through research that really focused on the behaviours of those with limited capability or resilience. We found there to be 20 million vulnerable adults in the UK, financially vulnerable, and then broke this population down into 6 segments, ranging from those in precarious situations, so getting by, but with an income shock, maybe an income shock away from difficulty, to those already with mounting debts or no access to credit. A huge number of data points, some from CACI, some from additional sources such as Financial Lives, and then further qualitative research gave Fair for All a really deep understanding of the different groups of financially vulnerable people. They now work with banks, building societies, credit unions, other lenders, and they share this segmentation. They're helping organisations understand who their customers are, their lending and saving requirements, their behaviours, their attitudes, and importantly, the specific needs and considerations of each vulnerable segment. It's a really great use case of a real-life segmentation in action, helping the industry improve outcomes for vulnerable customers. And if you'd like to find out more here, Fair for All would love to hear from you. So let us know, drop us a message, and we'll be more than happy to put you in touch with them. So far, we've focused on looking at vulnerability across groups of people, segments. But staying with market data, let's look at individual level metrics that can be applied to customers. Now, most organisations will be flagging between 5 and 20% of customers as vulnerable. But according to the FCA, up to 47% of consumers may be vulnerable. So how do you identify that gap? Well, here, it might be where we look to a data or an AI approach. And CACI has built up a picture of vulnerability, 3 separate metrics that append an indicator to every single adult in the UK based on a range of data points. And here listed, we've just got a few examples. Now, it's worth pointing out that this is modelled data. It's no way intended to replace what you already know about your customers. But it is designed to supplement it and identify pockets of vulnerability in places not currently picked up. The components very much speak to the ideas of resilience and capability cited by the FCA. And in fact, the FCA themselves recently referenced commercially available data just like this as an appropriate means of looking at vulnerability. And so what you can do is you can score up and code the vulnerability data onto customers. And once they've been assigned scores, different groups can be profiled and compared to each other. The indicators work very much like deciles. And so in theory, if you've got a NatRep base, they should have the same number of customers in each decile. In this chart here, we've got most vulnerable on the left and the least vulnerable on the right. And this organization's customers, those are the gray bars you can see here, are slightly skewed towards the first 5 deciles, suggesting a slightly higher than average vulnerability. We've also shown profiles for holders of 2 different products. The first one, in blue, sits towards the right and shows very little vulnerability. There's potentially some vulnerability here, and of course this shouldn't be ignored. But overall, if this was something like a packaged bank account, it might help evidence that the product hasn't been wrongly targeted or potentially missold. Whilst the second product in red, whilst broadly in line with the grey customer bars, does have a slightly more vulnerable profile. Whilst not necessarily implying anything untoward, it does flag this product as perhaps warranting a closer look. And in terms of looking at journeys, it might be where to start. When you have an idea of where likely pockets of vulnerability are, an understanding of which segments and which vulnerabilities are likely to be involved, then you can take a much more targeted look at individual customer experiences. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Mira, who'll talk just about that.
Thanks, Jamie. So Jamie's talked about what the segmentation and the macro data can tell you and how to use this to plan and prioritize your work at a strategic level, including understanding which customer segments you'd like to focus on. But we need to build on this because consumer duty also requires firms to work at the micro level. When you're evaluating customer journeys and interactions, you need to make sure you have an understanding of real customer experiences at an individual level. And this means that ensuring positive and fair outcomes needs insights into the nuanced context and dynamic circumstances that may be at play for customers, particularly those in vulnerable circumstances. And this layered understanding is important because, as we all know, vulnerability can occur at any time to anyone. And we've seen this highlighted many times in our research work with people who've been through these challenges. Vulnerabilities ebb and flow. So, for instance, if they're triggered by events like bereavement, sudden caring responsibilities, or an illness, or the breakdown of a relationship. And these experiences and nuances within and around them are really hard to capture in most more static data sets. Another thing to bear in mind is the intersectional nature of these challenges. So for instance, someone going through a divorce would typically also be experiencing lower emotional resilience. Or the midlife pressed renters that Jamie spoke about, they may be at greater risk of health-related challenges or becoming victims of fraud. So how do we capture all this understanding on an ongoing basis? To start with, making sure you're looking at multiple sources of data, from structured analytics and metrics that you may already be tracking to complaints and even anecdotal information from frontline staff. I know a couple of people in the chat mentioned, when you're working with non-experts, when you're working with third-party partners as well, any information is useful at this point, and you need to make sure that you're bringing this along. So tagging and cross-referencing these and also assessing them in context of the data and segmentation work that you have going to surface themes and possible hypotheses that you can then explore and validate in primary research. And when we've done this in in-depth qualitative research for many clients, the teams we've played the insights back to have always found them extremely powerful, and it's helped build empathy and create genuinely impactful changes to help vulnerable customers. Carrying out the research needs a considerate, sensitive approach, and you may want to also consider specialist user researchers, charities, and organizations for some of this work. And all of this is key to building a culture and a framework of insight gathering and knowledge sharing across teams, both within your organization, but within the ecosystem of the customer, whether it's third party or not. and whether you interact with these customers directly or not. So a lot of what I've mentioned you may already be doing, but I'm just calling these out anyway because your organizations may be at different stages of work around this topic, or you might be focusing on one element of this. The important thing here is that all of these add to a layered and holistic understanding of vulnerable customers. And what are some of the artifacts that bring the qual and the quant research to life? They may be a series of personas or artifacts reflecting the segments of your customer base. And we're not talking about aspirational marketing personas, but personas around the end customers based on in-depth research. And while they're not real people, they are the synthesis of real data and allow us to summarize and communicate insights internally about people who have been observed and researched. Customer journey maps from the perspective of the end customer or the persona or the archetype are also absolutely key. So in the multi-firm review from earlier in the year, the FCA reported on the failure of firms in addressing weaknesses in processes that track vulnerable customers across multiple product sets. So it's important to incorporate all points of interaction, whether they sit within your organizations or with the third parties, and the different products and services when evaluating journeys. But going back to my earlier point around the nature of vulnerabilities, how do we reflect this fluidity in the way we use things like personas and customer journey maps to drive better understanding and outcomes? An approach we've used with our clients to visualize and bring this to life is the concept of vulnerability lens. So these are core events that may trigger vulnerability. They may look like personas, but are different from them as they're not specific to a particular customer segment, and do not include things like demographics, etc. And it's fundamentally grounded in the idea that anyone is at risk of becoming vulnerable. They're based on data and research, particularly qualitative research, and should reflect the vulnerability scenarios that are specific to your firm's customers and ones that may trigger the most financial and process impact. And this is really key, as you can then focus on the most prevalent events. For instance, you may find from the prioritized segments that Jamie spoke about earlier, like the midlife press renters and others, that scenarios like fraud or bereavement are more likely to occur. So you want to make sure you're including them. And we'll take a closer look at this. As I mentioned, the scenario should be relevant to your segments and your personas. And the example here is of a bereavement scenario. You can, of course, structure it in many ways, but the goal here is to make sure it creates empathy and brings to light the key factors needed for decision-making around customer journeys. I'd like to call out some of the components and details that we found helpful after using this in several cases. So description of the typical context, maybe the type of things that triggered the scenario and how someone in this situation would look to interact with your organization, whether it's in person, on the phone, or digitally. And if you are developing this in conjunction with your partners, you might want to incorporate that as well within the lens. Again, recognizing the intersectionality and how some vulnerabilities overlap and interact, you want to highlight what any linked or additional vulnerabilities may be. So for instance, someone who's been through a bereavement may also be more susceptible to being targeted by fraudsters. You can call out typical emotions and reactions, as well as any financial risks that may be triggered by someone going through this, and therefore the additional support that they may need. And finally, from your organization's perspective, you want to call out what supportive actions and interventions may currently be in place, maybe from a relationship management perspective, or communications, or process-related safeguards. And I just wanted to call out one additional thing in addition to the customer journey work, because I know that a couple of people have spoken about what if we have non-experts, for instance. And so just as an example, we've helped one large financial institution to use these lenses as part of their staff training, with people, whether it's frontline staff or not, to really build that understanding and awareness around what sort of triggers to look for? What do vulnerable customers look like and feel, and how can they incorporate this in their ways of working? Essentially, we've used this to start building some of those conversations. We did a series of roadshows with different teams where they could talk about this and share their experiences. So how do you bring all this together? In a snapshot, starting with identifying the key segments to focus on based on the macro data and the segmentation work, building out or validating the personas within these to make sure you really understand their goals, their motivations and contexts, and then using the scenario-based vulnerability lens to bring their specific situation and needs to life. And just to point out, this is very much a live document, not an artifact that I would say you just leave it on a shared drive. But as you go through and have these conversations with people, you need to make sure you're iterating and incorporating those insights into the vulnerability lens. And then you use that lens to view, assess, and evaluate the relationship or product journeys to identify outcomes, roadblocks, and potential for financial harm that need to be addressed. And I'll hand back to Brendan because he'll talk a little bit more about how you can take this forward.
Thanks, Miriam. So once you've got a list of issues and problems, the next step potentially is then to prioritize those. Now, there's lots of ways that the issues and problems can be prioritized. It can be done very simply from using tools such as Moscow and Kano, or it might be quite a complex mechanism that you have within your organization with front door evaluation models driving into change. What we've seen in organizations that employ the more complex models to establish priorities is that it can in itself become a bit of a blocker to agile change management. And if you're faced with a lot of issues and complex issues, trying to keep things simple often helps. And we advocate consideration of the likes of a simple 2x2 Eisenhower matrix to look at prioritization. And within that approach, you can look at putting things such as ensuring that customer experience is measured, alongside the likes of assessing customer harm. So what we're doing is we're putting the customer absolutely front and center of the prioritization process in order to help to drive that change. And what we do is we advocate very close working with internal compliance and risk teams to ensure that that prioritization approach is pre-agreed up front. But once you've then done that, you can then take the more serious issues, those that are scoring the highest, and take them into ideation sessions. And we advocate running ideation sessions with a multidisciplinary team of subject matter experts and product and journey owners who can look at the problem and come up with what is an ideal solution to improve and to remove the customer harm. But sometimes those ideal solutions, they can involve quite complex development and change to systems that is going to take time to actually enact. And hence we also advocate thinking within those ideation sessions about what sort of tangible quick wins can be applied to help to address the problems. Simple operational workflow changes, changes to standard operating processes, guidance for users and staff alike, and running the sort of sessions with third parties that Mira mentioned earlier on. Simple things like changes to web content have been seen to provide real yet inexpensive benefit to customers.
Brendan, just before you move on to the next slide, there's a question in the chat that I think would be well timed here. The question is about how do you engage with all areas of the organization at a level that suits them regarding consumer duty? And I understand you've just done quite an extensive project that's been looking at just this for another organization.
Yes, and of course, sometimes different language needs to be used at different levels of an organization, and you have to take a different approach. At a more senior level, it's about risk mitigation, it's about compliance with the regulation, and it's about ensuring that all due process is being undertaken. Whereas at an operational level, it's more about enacting the change and seeing things through and getting prioritization within workflow. But understanding consumer duty is at the core of it. understanding the priority that it has within the organization and the importance it has to the organization at all levels is very important to do. And then making sure that people understand what their role is in terms of helping the organization to comply with the regulations and ultimately do a great job for customers. But as issues are discovered, as they're prioritized, as solutions are developed, and decisions are made as to where they should be taken, it's really important to weave those in to the roadmap for change, to ensure that the tasks and timelines are well assigned and that people understand what they have to do and that they are taking ownership of the tasks and responsibilities that they have, whether that is from a communications perspective across the organization, or change in terms of digital systems, or from a trainer who is engaging with third parties. Having the implementation plans in place, and most importantly, tracking the outcomes of that through to completion is really important to do. But then, of course, at a senior level, management would want to see that the changes that are being embedded are actually driving change and they're driving improvement and benefit for the customers. So you also have to weave into your programs. How are you going to track the outcomes of the changes that you're making, whether those are quick wins or long-term changes? And continual measurement is really important.
Excellent. Thank you, Brendan. I've got a couple of other questions that have come through. One is about, it's probably best directed to Mira, I would suggest. So obviously you went through some vulnerability lenses as part of your section. If a customer has been identified for having multiple vulnerability factors that organizations need to be aware of, how do you combine vulnerability lenses and create customer journey based on that?
Yeah, so this is quite a common scenario. And through the research work we've done with some clients, we've obviously seen some patterns where you almost have, for want of a better word, groups or families of vulnerabilities, or some vulnerabilities tend to follow another type of vulnerability. So somebody going through long-term illness, there's probably bereavement and things that may be associated, or as I mentioned, somebody who's going through a relationship breakdown might be at risk of fraud, might be at risk of lower emotional resilience. I think probably looking at them as families of vulnerabilities is important. In the lens itself, in that document, the screenshot that we had seen, there was a section to call out additional and associated vulnerabilities, so that when you are looking at somebody who's going through ill health, you're also taking into account possible other vulnerabilities that might be at play. So you can take that sort of complex view when evaluating journeys. So I think there are ways to do this. There is no one size fits all. It does depend on your particular customers and your segments and what would apply to them. But yeah, probably speaking to frontline staff to see what are the additional vulnerabilities in these sort of situations, and making sure that's fed back and incorporated into the lens is probably the best way to approach it.
Brilliant. And just for my interest, really, it's not a question that's come up actually. So do you have any examples of organizations, and you don't need to mention the organizations, that you think are tackling their relationships with vulnerable customers, both internally and directly to the customers, really well? Or have you seen any good techniques that you think, oh wow, that's a good approach, other organizations should be thinking about that?
I think historically there have been some organizations where their business model's very much customer first and it's relationship focused, where a lot of the responsibility for the customers and that customer experience is with the frontline staff. And because of, they place the customers and that relationship at the heart of everything they do, from a consumer duty perspective, often meeting, good customer outcomes is not necessarily a problem for them. It's evidencing that often tends to be an issue. I've seen one example on one of the panels that I had spoken at where they talked about a customer service team where if somebody calls in and they either identify themselves as vulnerable, or the customer service agent picks up that they are in a vulnerable situation, then you don't apply any additional metrics, around call completion times and things like that. So essentially, the key is to empower the people who are in direct contact with the customers to take those decisions and do what's right for the customers without having to worry about additional metrics and things like that. So I know that some organizations have changed the way they do things and have tried to empower the frontline staff much more through additional training and support.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mira. I've had a question that's probably best directed at you, Jamie. So it is somebody that's currently licensing CACI's Acorn dataset, which, for those that are not aware, that's a postcode level geodemographic segmentation, but not the Fresco data that you referenced within your section. Is Fresco distinctly more accurate than Acorn when it comes to financial segmentation?
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, so just as a reminder, an Acorn classifies and groups people up by the postcode they live in. So everybody living in the same postcode, i.e. a side of a street, for example, will be within the same sort of customer segment. And you're going to have a range of different households through age, levels of affluence, for example, within that. Something about financial service in particular, but also vulnerability in particular, is very much, we've played on the idea, it's very much an individual personal thing. A lot of the life events, for example, even to some extent, some of the capabilities, the resilience measures are very, very correlated with age or life stage in terms of the likelihoods of when they occur. I think with something like Acorn, there's a danger of missing out on some of those nuances and really not being able to identify the pockets, the vulnerability that you're looking at, which certainly recommend or suggest moving to a more individual level view, if at all possible.
Thank you, Jamie. There's a couple of more questions that have come through. So the first one is how, and it's probably whoever dibs it first can pick it up. So how do you record vulnerable customers where an organization doesn't necessarily own the customer? So if it's sold via a third party, but that organization has responsibilities under vulnerable customer outcomes. So that customer information is passed on to the organization just after point of sale. Brendan's fastest finger first. Super keen there.
Well, I'll try and come in on that one, but Mira, do feel free to add afterwards. But I think, when it comes to third parties, there is a duty of care and responsibility to ensure that the third parties are acting on your behalf in the correct manner, and therefore that they should have an awareness of how to assess the individuals that they're working with and whether or not indeed they have vulnerability characteristics. And those could be captured and then passed on within the process of sales or the communications and engagement that is being undertaken at that early stage of reference. And that would help then to provide consistency and capability when it gets handed over from the third party to action accordingly and in a similar manner to the way that the third party acts. But of course, the training that has been mentioned before and just the awareness and understanding of the different types of vulnerabilities will help third parties to act in the right way. So, potentially engagement sessions and better communications and support information for them would help to improve their capability on your behalf. Mira, I don't know if you want to
Yeah, no,
that.
it's, I think, quite interesting because I guess from my perspective, from a user research perspective, what's important is to make sure you collect, even if it's aggregated information, it doesn't need to be identifiable, but if you make sure that you're taking a holistic approach to understanding what specific aspects of the customer journey, the customer characteristics you're able to pick up and report back on, but also making sure that you're in constant discussions with the third party so you have a joint view of what vulnerable customers may look like, what the different vulnerable scenarios could look like, what we need to look out for, what you can make sure you're aggregating and reporting back on, to then see, okay, how do we redesign some of these journeys? How do we make it better for these customers? And just to make sure that the information flows both ways, that the right aspects, the right factors and details are being captured, and that you're able to provide the third party with the right support as well.
Is there a risk with that, Mira, if the relationship has come via a third party, and I suppose, is there a risk across all of this that you might inadvertently make a vulnerable customer feel stigmatized or picked out of a crowd in a negative way?
You might, but I guess that's why when you look at customer journeys, you need to make sure that it's quite end-to-end and holistic. So you're picking that up as part of your customer journey work to see, where are the obstacles, what are the sensitivities, and I think this should be picked up in good customer journey mapping, where it should be a journey from the customer's perspective, not just from your organization's perspective and the third party's perspective, but it's just overarching from the point of view of an end customer.
I'm going to finish off, because I appreciate people want to have a coffee before their next meeting. I'm going to finish off on 2 questions. You can pick up one or the other, or both if you want, to each of our presenters. So the first question is, what would be your number 1 tip to get all the staff within an organization putting vulnerable customers first? And then the second question would be, so you can have an either or, are there any other sectors that you think are already approaching this really well that the financial services sector could learn from? Jamie, I'm going to pass to you first. Right on the spot.
I think, I think the main thing is something that's already happening an awful lot in financial services, especially in retail banking, which has traditionally been very sort of product siloed. I think is a fair description of how the industry has sort of operated over sort of the last few years. I think moving towards a more consumer first way of thinking, whether it's in product design, proposition, thinking about that way of thinking, starting with needs and wants of individual customers, consumers. That's the way you can start then thinking about potential vulnerabilities and needs that way, and then designing the products and services around that.
Thank you, Jamie. Brendan?
I think my top tip would be to basically lobby and bring on board senior management to help to drive that narrative down throughout the organization. You need to get at least a senior responsible officer advocating that vulnerable customers and a focus towards them needs to happen by everyone throughout the organization that is in some way, shape or form a frontline staff operative. And once that narrative starts to feed down, then it helps to sort of pave the way for change in behavior across the organization.
Thank you. And Mira?
Yeah, my top tip would be to make sure any research, any customer research is being socialized at all levels of the organization. So whether that means you have like a customer forum day or something where you bring out some of the qualitative research, the customer stories and the insights out, and showcase that across different teams, across different levels. I think that would be key, because the more you start bringing to life the experiences of the end customer, the more people can start to build the empathy and see how they can incorporate this in their ways of working.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much for joining today.